Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to go ahead and get into part 2 of the Blau series by TIK, or the Blau video by TIK. I split it up into two so that I wouldn't have like 1 2-hour video, but I'm putting them both out today, so let's go ahead and get into it.
For too long, although Vikes had also wanted the Panzers for Voronezh too. So anyway, the Blau plan was in tatters and the Soviets were now responding. In the wake of the German attack and for his failings here and in the previous year, Timoshenko was dismissed, and in his place the Stavka created two new fronts. The first was the Voronezh front on the 7th of July, which would be commanded by Vatutin on the 14th of July, and the Stalingrad front created on the 12th of July. This would be commanded by Gordov from the 21st of July. The Stalingrad front consisted of three reserve armies: the 62nd under Kolpachi, 63rd under Kuznetsov, and 64th under Churikov. Two of these reserve armies would become famous in the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, the Soviet High Command still thought that the Voronezh front was the most important because the Germans were clearly aiming towards Moscow. And so the Voronezh front engages with Salmuth's Second Army. But the Stalingrad front's forces are miles away. They're at the Don Bend, and really there's nothing between them and the Germans. The Germans then continue what can only be described as a disaster of their Blitzkrieg, or Bewegungskrieg warfare. An intelligence report indicated that the Soviets had withdrawn to the east of Rostov, so the Germans untangled their armoured forces massing at Milerovo, which itself wasn't a slick affair, and 1st Panzer Army was sent back across the Donets River, which it had already crossed in the first stage of Blue, to thrust then towards Rostov. 4th Panzer Army was sent southeast towards the Don, northeast of Rostov, trying to encircle Soviet forces south of the river. 17th Army and 3rd Romanian Army would march from the west as well. The only exception was Paulus's 6th Army, which was heading towards the Don Bend. All these armies, except for the 6th, fell upon Rostov, which was captured on the 23rd of July. Interestingly, the forces that initially took Rostov in 1941 were the same forces that had taken it in 1942 as well. But just like at Milerovo,
That's super interesting. I would not have guessed that it was the same group.
pincers at Rostov came up empty. Barely 33,000 prisoners were taken, and it turns out the intelligence report had been faulty, much like the rest of the plan for Blau. Despite taking territory, the German army had not gobbled up the Soviet forces in front of it, and it had only got this far by consuming large quantities of its own fuel. Its logistics were getting stretched further and further the more miles it went, and there was nothing immediately ahead of the pincers to destroy. So now we come to possibly one of the big decisions of the war, one which scholars have pondered over for years and which nobody seems to have made a clear answer to. We're talking about Führer Directive number 45. This order is the catalyst for the disaster at Stalingrad and has been seen as the ultimate failure of the German summer offensive in 1942. If you think Stalingrad and the events of 1942 are the turning point of World War II, or just one of the big turning points, then this is the order that you absolutely have to understand. Now, much like the Soviet retreat or rout debate before, scholars are still debating the reasons for the decisions made in Führer Order number 45. So, as not to get ahead of ourselves, first I'm going to give you the reasons for the decisions made in the context of Blau and the wider war, and then once you understand why this decision was made, then I'll explain the consequences of the decisions. The German economy and the war effort is suffering under a massive oil crisis. Even with Romanian oil, the deficit is crippling. Germany needs the oil of the Caucasus in order to continue the wider war. Germany is also at war with Britain and the United States, And while they only have 3 divisions tied down in North Africa at this point, there is a constant threat of an attack in the west. Britain had raided the French coast at Bruneval in February 1942 and would also raid again in mid-August, the famous Dieppe raid. In addition, there was a larger threat of invasion thanks to the United States, and the only way Germany could hope to win a fight against the USA was to gain the oil her economy and mechanized forces needed. Hitler was aware of the Soviet press and propaganda talking about a coming second front in the West as promised by the Western Allies. Hitler was also aware that the success of the Western Allies is dependent on the Soviet Union surviving in the East. The more he wins in the East, the more likely an invasion of the West becomes, because the Allies have to attack Germany while her armies in the East are tied up. Hitler may have been an evil man, but he was also the leader of a nation, and he was not insane. He understood the strategic picture very well.
Okay, so I'm curious about what you guys think on this. You know, there's a lot of back and forth between Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt about opening up this front in the West, getting some pressure off of the Soviet Union. You know, Stalin is pushing and pushing and pushing, trying to get there to be an open Western front. And then there's a back and forth between Roosevelt and Churchill on where this is going to be and how it's going to be done and all that. Do you guys think if the Soviet Union falls, or let's say that the Germans take the oil and they take the Ukraine, then they take the oil in the Caucasus, and the Soviet Union is collapsing in on itself? Maybe not immediately, but it's obvious that it is not going to sustain. Do you guys think that there is an invasion by the Western powers for the way that it was done? I'm very curious about that, about what you guys think about that.
Unlike many of his generals who were trained to look at things tactically and operationally, he understood that this war was a war for resources. As Toprani says, this was the first war for oil. And he understood that time was running out for Germany. The window for success, a hard time limit, was closing, and if Germany didn't get oil soon, she would no longer be able to wage a war of movement, and she would ultimately lose the static attritional war that would follow. But in addition to the strategic situation and the need for oil, so far the Blau operation had been an operational mess. It hadn't achieved anything except for take some ground. It may have been a tactical success, maybe an operational success, I guess you could say, but so far none of this had translated into a strategic success, and it really needed to turn into one soon. The good news was that the Soviet Red Army was no longer in the field. She had disintegrated. Hitler and the Army High Command had believed prior to Blau that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse, and they had just witnessed this collapse, or at least they thought so. Regardless of whether it was an intentional retreat or a rout, or both, that event, that collapse, leads Hitler to the conclusion that the Soviet will to fight is dead. In his mind, the only thing stopping the Germans from getting to Astrakhan was the terrain and the fuel gauge. He concludes that the Soviets will not be able to create a viable defensive position west of the Volga River. But he also knew what was happening elsewhere. Leningrad was still under siege, and perhaps more importantly, fighting was going on in the Rzhev area near Moscow. The Germans had kept approximately 1/3 of all its divisions on the Eastern Front at the Rzhev Miasma salient, which, from the words of at least one historian, shows its desire to retain a suitable bridgehead as a staging area for a later offensive.
Again, which is why it's, if the whole thing is oil, then my thought process is, to hell with everything else. Get the oil and the resources from the Ukraine, but get the oil, and then you can figure out everything else after that. but like this planning ahead for a future offensive whenever you literally have 2 minutes until the clock strikes midnight because of your oil situation. That seems like too long-sighted thinking.
Operation Seidlitz had just come to an end on the 22nd of July. This was the clearing up operation of 2 large bodies of Soviet troops in the rear of the German forces at Rzhev. And while casualty figures for the Germans are unknown because of poor German record keeping, it is known that the German divisions taking part in this clearing up operation were bled white. They were therefore in desperate need of replacements or reinforcements. Plus, with more Soviet offensive in this area incoming, which they were, and with a possibility of launching their own offensive to take Moscow in 1942, it makes sense to shift priority away from the south to the centre. Bearing all this in mind, especially the time limit and the need for oil, Hitler decides to roll the dice once more. He makes the decision to strike towards the Caucasus and the oil fields now. In the original plan of Blau, Army Group South, now split into 2, would strike east to Astrakhan first, form a northern blocking line, then strike south to the Caucasus oil fields. So east first, then south. But now the plan is to strike towards Astrakhan and into the Caucasus simultaneously, east and south together. Including the Voronezh area, this was basically splitting the German forces over 3 strategic axes with 2 half-army groups at the same time. It is a big gamble, but Hitler feels that there's no alternative to this. Time is running out. He needs to get the oil now.
And you can kind of see the thought process, not just that they need the oil, which you know they need the oil, but if everywhere in the southern region you're going, there is a rout of Soviet soldiers in front of you, then you can understand the thought process of like, okay, well then we'll be all right to spread ourselves thin here and just try to make like a mad dash towards the oil. At least I can comprehend that thought process.
As part of this order, he sends 4 armies south in Army Group A, 1st and 4th Panzer Armies, 17th Army and Romanian 3rd Army. Army Group B will consist of German 2nd Army, Hungarian 2nd Army, 8th Italian Army and German 6th Army. Manstein's 11th Army was initially committed to go south as well, but was withdrawn, which we'll come back to. And finally, 6th Army was also ordered to take Stalingrad for an eventual thrust on Astrakhan. Now, 6th Army is a big army. It has 6 corps at this time and may have been the biggest German army on the Eastern Front as well. That said, it was given objectives that were far beyond its capabilities. But Hitler does not see this because Hitler thinks the Soviets have been defeated, in the south at least. But this is a false belief, and by diluting his forces, what happens is Axis units along the Don are facing undefeated and quite powerful Red Army forces. In fact, the Red Army had a front facing each of the 3 Axis armies of Army Group B at this time. Bryansk front with more than 3 armies against Salmuth's 2nd Army, Voronezh front with 2 armies facing Janis' Hungarian 2nd Army, and the Stalingrad front with 5 mostly reserve armies and 2 tank armies, although these hadn't actually formed yet, facing Paulus's 6th Army. So this is optimism at best, and overconfidence at the least. The rout of Soviet forces in the early part of Blau convinced Hitler that Manstein's 11th Army wasn't even needed, and it began moving to the Leningrad area to influence that siege. As I said last time, 11 of the German divisions taking part in Blau were withdrawn by mid-August. 24th, 132nd and 170th Infantry plus the 28th Jaeger divisions were sent to Army Group North. The Großdeutschland Motorised Infantry Division, 9th and 11th Panzer Divisions and the 72nd Infantry Division were sent to Army Group Center.
Oh my gosh, they sent motorized and panzer units north. Like, that is literally what you need more than anything else if you're going to do this big long trek into the Caucasus, and you send them north. Like, what is going on?
And the 1st Motorized SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division and the 22nd and 257th Infantry Divisions were also sent to the west. This was 15% of the German divisions deployed for Blau and 25% of Blau's mobile formations. On top of the fact that reinforcements had already been deprioritized for the southern front and sent to the central front, as shown in last Monday's video, this effectively stripped and diluted the German forces in the south. They no longer had the strength they needed to complete their objectives. Worse, the supply situation is completely messed up. Priority goes to Army Group A, racing off to the Caucasus. And that's fine, but 6th Army is starved of supplies. Paulus engages Soviet forces at the Don Bend on the 24th of July, and by the 26th of July, as a combination of stiff Soviet resistance but also a lack of fuel and ammunition, Paulus's army comes to a halt at the Don Bend. Coupled with the People's Commissariat of Defence Order No. 227, the infamous not a step back order, which was issued on the 28th of July 1942, 6th Army becomes embroiled against 4 Soviet armies and suffers heavy casualties. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with this part of the battle today because I'll be covering this in much greater detail in my main Battlestorm Stalingrad documentary, which is coming. But effectively, from the 24th of July onwards, the Battle of Stalingrad is on, and Paulus's forces are suffering heavily, and they haven't even reached the city yet. Hitler, having stripped Army Group B down far too much, realises that he's made a mistake. He sees that he needs to reinforce Paulus quickly in order to get the offensive going again, so he orders Hoth's 4th Panzer Army from Army Group A to turn about once more and come back to Paulus's rescue. It wasn't until the 7th of August that Paulus could get going again, and Hoth's forces sputtered into action from the 31st onwards, since fuel was also lacking for him as well. The logistics strain on the whole southern front was having a massive impact which would plague both Paulus and Hoth all the way up and into the thick of the fighting inside Stalingrad city. Meanwhile, this stripping of 4th Panzer Army from Army Group A, plus the fact that Manstein's 11th Army had gone on a picnic to Leningrad, meant that List had just 3 armies: 1st Panzer Army, 17th Army and Romanian 3rd Army. These would have to drive the 650 kilometers to Grozny, getting stretched thinner and thinner.
And just to put into perspective, this is the most strategically important thing for this whole campaign. The most strategically important thing is the oil, and they don't have enough they don't have enough divisions to do anything down here. It is really, really bizarre, the mistakes that were made here and the total just absolute cluster that this becomes.
Over a front that was 300 kilometers wide while they drive further and further away from their supply base. Oh, and List only had 1 German infantry division, the 46th. The rest were mobile units, meaning his force on a whole lacked infantry. Nonetheless, List crashed through the Soviet front lines on the 26th of July and just kept on driving. The Romanians were subordinated to Ruoff's 17th Army, which is now renamed Army Group Ruoff, although this was more of a Kampfgruppe style unit rather than a separate army group, since it was still under Army Group A. The Romanians and the 17th Army marched sort of along the coast, while Kleist's army raced off towards Mayakop. Initially, they made great success. The Soviets just fled before them, and Mayakop fell on the 11th of August. Stalin was no fool though. Prior to the fall of Mayakop, he warned Deputy Oil Commissar Nikolai Baibakov that if he doesn't destroy the oil fields before the Germans capture them,
he's dead.
He would be shot. This was a good incentive. The Germans found the oil fields completely destroyed, and, well, they were actually impressed by the effort the Soviets went to in order to prevent the Germans from using the oil fields. The Germans would get the oil fields up and running again, slightly, but they only got in the region of 750 tons of crude oil from Mayakop, which was a drop in the ocean compared to what they actually needed. Therefore, the destruction of the oil fields was a success. So, well done, Baibakov. Now, while Mayakop may have fallen, Soviet General Budeny, commander of the North Caucasus Front, was beginning to slowly regain control of the routed forces beneath him. And the thing is, while most of the troops were fleeing at this moment in time, if he could steady them, he'd have in the region of 600,000 men, although 87,000 of these would be sailors from the Black Sea Fleet. This would be more than enough to halt the diluted forces of Army Group A. And indeed it was. By late August, List's forces had ground to a halt in the Caucasus Mountains and had been unable to get to Grozny. Reinforcements could not be sent because 4th Panzer and 6th Armies were embattled at Stalingrad. There were Soviet attacks going on at Voronezh and Demyansk, plus Zhukov and then Konyev's attacks at Rzhev from the 30th of July until September, which kept Army Group Centre tied down. So it was obvious to all, Blau had failed and its conduct was a complete disaster. This had not been a smooth operation. It hadn't captured nearly as many Soviet prisoners as hoped, and it had stretched the German elastic band to breaking point. The armies in the Caucasus and Stalingrad were now starved of fuel and ammunition. Reinforcements were being sent to the centre rather than the south, which would have massive consequences on the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Red Army had not actually been destroyed. They had been routed, but now they regained their composure. They hadn't suffered ridiculous casualties, certainly not as bad as the year before, and now, with the Ural factories online, they were getting more and better tanks, artillery, mortars, aircraft. They were getting the communications equipment needed to conduct offensive operations. They were reorganising their units and husbanding their resources for a future attack. Blau had spread the German forces out thin across a wide front of 4,100 kilometres. Their logistics were struggling to keep up, and they had, due to either poor staff work or logistics, failed to reinforce Army Group B sufficiently. So, when the Soviets mass for their Operation Uranus, there is nothing beyond the thin crust of Axis frontline troops that can stop them. Blau is a failure in and of itself, but it gives the Soviets a golden opportunity to strike back, and when they do, they wipe out several Axis armies and drive them back to Blau's starting point. Both Hitler and Stalin instinctively seem to grasp this even before the conclusion of the Blau campaign. Hitler's anger boils over and he no longer listens to his generals who have failed him. Bock's already gone. List is sacked on the 9th of September for failing to keep the offensive going. Several others, like General Heim, are sacked as well. Halder, the guy who failed in Barbarossa, failed again at Blau and who constantly argued and lied to his Führer, is sacked on the 24th of September. He is replaced with Zeitzler, who would follow Hitler's orders somewhat more loyally than the scheming Halder did. This replacement of Halder can be seen as the end of the traditional German general staff way of war and the transition into a new style of warfare, one with Hitler in charge for a change. Hitler no longer trusts his generals who have betrayed him and disobeyed his orders time and time again, and wants them to do as he says. And interestingly, Stalin at the same time transforms from a person unwilling to listen to his generals and continually ordering them to stand or counterattack against ridiculous...
Yeah, they go in complete opposite directions here. Hitler gets, becomes a helicopter leader where he wants total control over every little detail of everything that's happening. And Stalin's going the other direction where he wanted that. And then as they're kind of switching, they go in opposite directions. Stalin gives more kind of control to on-the-ground leaders, and Hitler takes control away from on-the-ground leaders.
Odds to someone willing to take his general's advice and allow them time to prepare their offensives. The end of Blau, with the Germans stretched thin, and without the oil and supplies needed to attack everywhere, or even anywhere, gives Stalin that time. For the first real time in the war, he can say to his generals, sure, take 1 or 2 months to plan Operation Uranus, and get it organised. Oh, and you want to make a delay of a couple of days or even a couple of weeks? Well, sure, you can do that. And the failure of Blau really allows this to happen. Stalin and Hitler trade places, almost trade roles, and it is directly because of this turning point in the war. The initiative has gone over to the Soviets. Hitler knows he's failed and Stalin knows he's won. Effectively, we can sum up the outcome of Blau with this quote from Centino. By this point, the war with the Soviet Union had placed burdens on the Wehrmacht that were far heavier than the traditional German way of war could bear. Blitzkrieg had failed in Barbarossa and had failed in Blau, and this was the last gasp for victory by Hitler and his regime. Failure to take the oil meant Germany did not have the fuel and thus the resources to continue the war the way it wanted to. Blitzkrieg no longer worked. From now on, it had to fight a static war. In November 1942, at the height of German conquest, and just a few kilometres from Grozny, you have El Alamein, Operation Uranus, and then the Torch landings, which was the entry of the United States land troops into the war. The traditional German way of war was over. Blau came to an end not because of vast hordes of Soviet troops or masses of Lend-Lease trucks. It was because the German army just wasn't capable of going the distance. It was a sprinter, not a marathon runner, and it was not designed to fight the type of war going on the Eastern Front. It was playing a different game with different rules. This is why, even though I'm making a Battlestorm Stalingrad documentary, where I'll be going down to the divisional level and below for the entire Stalingrad campaign between the 24th of July 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943, I will happily stand here and tell you that Blau failed before that battle had even begun. I will also say that the Battle of Stalingrad was lost outside the city before the Germans had entered the city, and the conditions for that loss were set up during the Blau campaign. While I love going into details, and I intend to drown you in as much detail as possible in the Stalingrad documentary itself, success on the tactical level at Stalingrad would not have resulted in a strategic victory. But that doesn't mean it wasn't important, or that it's not interesting. Of course, the Battle of Stalingrad is interesting. We just need to realise that the war wasn't won or lost on the tactical level. And hopefully this video has put everything into perspective. Speaking of perspective, if you haven't seen my video on the oil crisis going on in Germany and why it is the most important reason why Germany lost the war and why Germany needed to take the Caucasus in 1942, go watch it. Link on the screen and in the pinned comment in the comment section below.
Okay, so that was the second half of TIK's Blau video. I'm actually using a couple of the sources that he pulled, and specifically one of the graphs that he uses. I believe both in the oil video and in this earlier in this Blau video. In the video I'm making on how the Germans could have won the war. From the perspective of the historians who believe the Germans could have won the war. I'm not personally dead set on the idea that they could have, but I see very little content on the way in which, from a tactical and strategic level, they could have pulled out a win in the war. And so I'm going to present some of those arguments in a video coming up. It's already recorded, but it has a ton of editing to go through. So I'm not sure exactly when it'll be out. But I'm going to keep working on it and keep putting out the new reaction videos and trying to keep up with the list that's getting longer for recommendations for different reactions. Again, I appreciate everybody who's given me recommendations and the new subscribers and all that. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you guys next time.